On the 6th of October 1973, Egypt and Syria coordinated a lightning surprise attack against Israel. Though short-lived, it was a war that would change the face of the modern Middle East. Yom Kippur War was yet another step in a long and bloody history of Arab-Jewish relations. The outcome of the Six-Day War of 1967, which led to the total humiliation of Arab states, was a direct link explaining the sparking of hostilities just 6 years later. With the occupation of the Sinai Peninsula and the overwhelming pressure of the whole Arab world calling for revenge, the newly elected Egyptian leader Anwar Sadat had little choice but to launch a new military operation. The war began at 2 p.m. on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, the Sabbath of Yom Kippur. In retrospect, the war marked the first step towards a bilateral peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that would dramatically alter Egypt's seminal role in the international politics of the Middle East. What were the global forces playing part in this conflict, and how did it bring the world's superpowers to the brink of a nuclear confrontation? Firstly, it is important to understand the internal political and military development happening in Egypt following the Six-Day War. From the military perspective, Arab experience had taught them to fear the Israeli Air Force. The Arabs had suffered tremendous losses in both men and equipment during that war. In just 6 days, the Egyptians, Jordanians, and Syrians had suffered 68,000 casualties and lost more than 1,000 tanks. The majority of the damage had come at the hands of the IAF. Israeli air superiority during the war gave them an unqualified advantage. In addition, Egypt's combat experience in the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the IAF strikes destroyed several Egyptian armored columns, also showed the vulnerability of its land forces. Other Arab nations also understood the threat posed by enemy aircraft. The Syrians realized that without their control of the skies, the Israelis would dominate their ground forces. Jordan also feared the long arm of the IAF. Concern over the capability of Israeli air power to destroy his forces and infrastructure was a major consideration for King Hussein in initially deciding not to join his Arab brothers in their war against Israel in 1973. The Arab states realized they were under a zone of influence exerted by the IAF. The first measure pursued by the Egyptians was to build an air force capable of destroying the IAF on the ground. To do this, they turned to the Soviet Union for medium bombers and fighter bombers that were capable of reaching targets inside Israel. The Russians were concerned about world opinion, and thus were reluctant to give the Egyptians assets with the required range and payload necessary to undertake the task. Instead, the Soviets offered short-range interceptors, better early warning radars, advisors, and a significant increase in SAM systems. The Soviets flooded Egypt with SA-2S, 3S, and 6S, as well as providing SA-7S for forward troops. The combination of these missile systems gave the Egyptians the ability to engage Israeli aircraft at all altitudes and within 15 miles of the Suez Canal. The Egyptians began a massive effort to construct an air defense system that would protect their vertical flank from a cross-canal attack. SAM site construction made up 90% of all Egyptian engineering efforts prior to the war. The Syrians also were building anti-air defenses, although with a little delay compared to Egypt. They began an accelerated program of SAM purchases in April 1973 that concentrated on buying mobile systems to protect frontline troops. They bought and deployed mostly SA-6 missiles, a system designed to support advancing armor columns. To defend their rear areas, the Syrians relied on the short-range interceptor aircraft they received from the Soviets that same spring. Thus, the Syrians had also built an integrated system that would challenge the IAF. Despite the impressive measures taken to counter the IAF, there were considerable limitations to Arab defense systems. First, most of the SAMs were relatively static and would not support a war of rapid maneuver. Second, the extensive SAM belt built by the Egyptians could only hit aircraft approximately 20 kilometers across the canal, meaning that it could not cover Egyptian troops going beyond that level. The bottom line was that while the Egyptian and Syrian armies were mobile, their air defenses were not. Their missile umbrella put a limitation on their area of maneuver, which in the end played a key role in the direction of this conflict. On the political front, there was also a significant development. After death of the Nasser in 1970, who was a prominent and glorified figure in the Arab world, the future began to look far from certain. In the end, the power was secured by Anwar Sadat, who served as vice president under Nasser. Sadat's rule was immediately challenged by many internal radical organizations who called for a new war against Israel and the restoration of Egyptian borders. Sadat inherited a huge political empire of Nasser, which was in need of a new strong leader. Within a year of his presidency, Sadat was forced to contend with an internal coup within his government, led by Nasserist Ali Sabri. The plot was successfully foiled, but Sadat seemed far from secure. On the 12th of October 1972, an army officer led troops into a mosque in central Cairo and called publicly for war with Israel. By late 1972, more and more Egyptians were speculating openly about how long Sadat could last and who would take over from him. It was clear that Sadat faced unparalleled pressures to wage war. As a weak successor to Nasser, he was seen as particularly vulnerable to pressures from the military and dramatic public protests. The tension was rising, and it seemed as if the war was the only way for Sadat to secure his power, while Arab forces were learning from their mistakes in the Six-Day War. Israeli forces only grew complacent and severely underestimated the enemy's capabilities. It was believed that even if war broke out, the currently mobilized Israeli forces would be able to easily hold off the attacks, while IAF delivered a devastating blow. The Israeli government was blinded by its recent performance in the 1967 war, by the assurance of the experts that no combined offensive was possible by its Arab neighbors, and that an early warning of any attack could be accurately predicted. This proved to be not the case. On the afternoon of October 6th, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel simultaneously on two fronts. Defending the Sinai was the responsibility of the Israeli Southern Command, under the command of Major General Golan. The Southern Command included two reserve divisions under Aden and Sharon, which had approximately 500 tanks between them, but which were not available until mobilization had occurred. Southern Command's one active division was commanded by Mandla. This division was comprised of 3 brigades totaling approximately 280 tanks, which were deployed with 2 armored brigades held in tactical reserve approximately 50 miles to the east of the canal, and 1 brigade forward along the canal. The defenses that Mandla's forces occupied included the Bar-Lev line, a series of fortifications along the canal's edge, which was manned by a reserve infantry battalion and a small number of tanks. The Egyptians began the war with 3 field armies, of which the 2nd and 3rd armies would be deployed for the operation. Under the command of General Saad el-Shazli, the Egyptian army forces that were employed in the crossing included 5 infantry divisions, 2 mechanized and 2 armored divisions, and 9 separate brigades. Altogether, the Egyptian army had approximately 1,500 tanks committed to the operation. The strategic goals that Egyptian President Sadat hoped to achieve by initiating the attack across the canal were limited to successfully crossing the canal and retaining a foothold in the Suez to break the political and military stalemate existing between Egypt and Israel. In order to accomplish this, the Egyptians planned a 3-phased operation. In Phase 1, a simultaneous crossing of the canal along a broad front would be executed by the 5 infantry divisions. Phase 2 included the consolidation of the bridgeheads into a continuous bridgehead line, the transfer of the mechanized and armored divisions to the east bank of the canal, and a temporary transition to the defensive in order to defeat the expected IDF counterattack. Phase 3 would see a continued attack by the mechanized and armored divisions to reach the Gidi and Mitla passes. Following their plan for a broad front crossing, the Egyptians quickly pushed across the canal and were able to establish divisional-sized bridgeheads on the east bank of the canal. In a 24-hour period, the Egyptians pushed approximately 100,000 soldiers and 1,000 tanks across to the east bank. In response, the Israeli tactical commander Mandla committed his available forces in a series of localized counterattacks to relieve the bypassed fortifications and conduct a holding operation while awaiting the arrival of Aden and Sharon's mobilized divisions. By the morning of the 8th of October, Mandla's division suffered severe casualties. Almost 2/3 of Mandla's tanks had been put out of action without stopping an overwhelming Egyptian attack. Between the 8th of October and the 14th of October, the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies consolidated and defended their positions along the east bank of the Suez, and continued to push armored forces across the Suez into the bridgehead. In response, the Israeli Southern Commander directed that Aden and Sharon's divisions conduct counterattacks to push the Egyptian forces back across the canal. However, These counterattacks were poorly coordinated and failed to achieve their objectives. As a result, the IDF refrained from conducting further counterattacks and prepared to defeat the follow-up Egyptian attacks. As for the Syrian front, the disposition of Israeli and Syrian forces mirrored the circumstances on the southern front. Both armies had built defensive positions on their side of the 1967 ceasefire line, known as the Purple Line. The Syrians had deployed 3 infantry divisions along the 45-mile front. These units were backed up by the Syrian 3rd Armored Division in the north and the 1st Armored Division in the center. The total Syrian force facing Israel numbered approximately 1,500 tanks, supported by some 1,000 guns, including heavy mortars and a surface-to-air missile system protecting Damascus. Opposing these forces were 2 Israeli armor brigades with a total of 170 tanks and 60 artillery pieces. The Syrian attack was synchronized with the Egyptian attack. 2 armor thrusts were launched across the Purple Line. The first was a supporting attack from the north aimed at seizing the town of Quneitra. The main effort was directed further south toward Rafid. Each attack relied on its armor forces to pass through a penetration made by the infantry and to drive swiftly to take the high ground east of the Jordan River. Countering this force were 2 Israeli armor brigades, with the mission of delaying these armor thrusts for 48 hours, thus allowing reinforcements to move north and take over the fight. The odds for the success of Israeli soldiers were small. The IDF was caught in a tenacious struggle with the Syrian ground forces that resulted in heavy Israeli casualties. The southernmost 188th Brigade lost most of its leaders and tanks. In the north, the 7th Brigade was reduced to 20 functional tanks. At the same time, the IAF had suffered tremendous losses in its attempts to provide close air support to the 7th and 188th Armor Brigades. After 24 hours of battle, the situation in the northern front was critical for the IDF. Early on the 8th of October, the Syrian attack had lost its momentum and Israeli reinforcements were already in their position. Israeli military leadership saw an opportunity to take the initiative away from the enemy. A counterattack was planned to retake territory up to the Purple Line. The IDF understood that stripping the immediate battlefield of its protection was the first step in driving the Syrians back. The main task was put on the Israeli Air Force. Despite initial heavy losses, Israeli command had no choice but to rely on their air force to conduct precise and deadly strikes to destabilize Syrian defenses. The strikes selected were sequential, with each strike paving the way for a deeper and more lucrative target. Among the first targets were the Air Force headquarters and the Ministry of Defense compound in Damascus. The Israeli jets delivered their attacks from treetop height, as much to minimize losses as to impress the Syrian man in the street. The final blow of the Israeli air campaign was directed at Syrian port facilities. The coastal cities of Latakia, Tartus, Banias, and the Syrian naval headquarters at Minat al-Badia were brutally attacked by the IAF. That night, the Israeli Navy also fired on these cities, causing severe damage to the port and oil storage facilities. This Israeli strategy worked well. With the success of these deep attacks, the Syrians were forced to move their air defense systems to protect Damascus and the ports. This action allowed the IAF to concentrate both ground and air power on Syrian forces west of the Purple Line. The superior tactical maneuvering of Israeli ground forces quickly turned the tables on the Syrians. By the 10th of October, the Syrians had been pushed back across the Purple Line. Now the military and political leadership began a debate as to what should be done next in the northern front. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir made the final decision. The IDF crossed the Purple Line on the 11th of October and continued the attack toward Damascus. Syrian President Assad was feeling the heat. His army was nearly destroyed. Assad pleaded with the Egyptians to apply pressure on the Israeli forces in the south. General Ismail Ali, the Egyptian Minister of War, promised action. Sadat found himself in an unfavorable position. On the one hand, his immediate objectives had been met. First, he had succeeded in consolidating his bridgehead on the east side of the canal. Second, Egyptian forces of the 2nd and 3rd Armies had parried all attempts by the IDF to break through Egyptian defenses. On the other hand, Sadat was now facing a situation in which an ally was pleading for help. If Syria was to lose, his army would be placed in the situation of fighting the combined Israeli forces of both the northern and southern fronts. The big question was whether the Egyptian army had the capability of launching a lightning attack. Sadat gave General Ismail his orders to initiate a new offensive to relieve Israeli pressure on the Syrian front. Egyptians launched their offensive on the 14th of October. As the Egyptians moved further east, away from their protective ADA umbrella, the Israeli Air Force had opportunities to engage enemy tanks with little fear of ground-to-air missile retaliation. The ensuing battle lasted only one day. As a result of the poor tactical application of its armor forces, the Egyptians lost 264 tanks and over 1,000 casualties, while the Israeli losses were 10 tanks. On the 15th of October, the Southern Command launched its counterattack to secure a foothold on the west side of the canal. In a daring tactical move laden with risk, Sharon's division secured a bridgehead on the west bank on the 16th of October. 2 days later, the Southern Command exploited the bridgehead with a two-division force, which raced into the operational areas of the 2nd and 3rd Egyptian armies. By the 22nd of October, the Israelis had cut off the 3rd Army and were threatening the rear of the 2nd Army. Further, the drive into the rear areas of the Egyptians had enabled the IDF to eliminate much of the ADA umbrella upon which Egyptian command of the air had been based, enabling the Israeli Air Force to establish air superiority over the theater. In the last week of the war, both Syria and Egypt suffered at the hands of the IDF. The combination of Israeli air power and land power had driven the Syrians back to their capital. Israeli forces in the west also advanced into Egypt and encircled an entire Egyptian army on the east bank of the Suez. At the same time, both the United States and the Soviet Union tried to resolve the conflict in a way that would benefit their own agenda. United States backed their ally Israel, while the Soviet Union strived to achieve dominance in the region by supporting Arab countries. Hoping to find a solution to the 1973 war, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Moscow on October 20th and agreed with the Soviets to seek a ceasefire in the region. When he landed back in Washington on October 23rd, Israel seemed to be ignoring the ceasefire proposal and instead had continued to encircle the Egyptian army. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev sent a hotline message to President Nixon confirming that Moscow felt betrayed. He implied that the US might have collaborated in Israeli actions. On October 24th, Moscow placed 4 airborne divisions on alert, which added to the 3 that had been alerted earlier that month. In addition, several Air Force units were alerted. The Soviets also had 7 amphibious warfare craft with naval infantry deployed in the Mediterranean. With some 40,000 combat troops ready for action, the Soviets posed a serious threat to the military balance on the Sinai. In addition, there was a Soviet ship carrying nuclear warheads that docked in Port Said. The warheads were believed to have been sent to a brigade of Soviet Scud missiles, previously deployed outside of Cairo. The local Yom Kippur War was now on the verge of turning into a global nuclear conflict if anything was to happen with those nuclear warheads. The US chose to use diplomatic means to threaten the Soviet Union with nuclear action. Kissinger alluded to the threat of nuclear war during a press conference at noon on the 25th at the State Department. "We possess, each of us, nuclear arsenals capable of annihilating humanity. We, both of us, have a special duty to see to it that confrontations are kept within bounds that do not threaten civilized life." Kissinger's statement demonstrated to the Soviets that the US was committed to preserving its strategic objectives in the Middle East. The US actions proved to be successful. The crisis was over within hours of Kissinger's press conference. An international peacekeeping force was ratified by the Security Council later on the 25th. In the end, only the intervention of the United States and the Soviet Union stopped the fighting. The Arab armies had originally performed admirably, but Israel had survived, and by the time of the ceasefire, achieved the upper hand. One of the main reasons for Israel's ability to turn the military tide was the combat employment of its air force. What the Arabs feared most, Israeli air superiority, had spelled their doom. Even though the war was a military failure for the Arabs, it laid an important diplomatic ground for further renegotiation between Israel and Egypt. As a result of a ceasefire, Israeli forces withdrew to the initial borderline between Syria and a United Nations peacekeeping force, established a buffer zone between the two armies in Sinai. The Israel-Egypt agreement was supplemented by another, signed on September 4, 1975, that included an additional withdrawal of forces and the expansion of the UN buffer zone. On March 26, 1979, following the Camp David Accords, Israel and Egypt made history by signing a permanent peace agreement that led to Israel's full withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula and to the normalization of ties between the two countries. In exchange, Egypt officially recognized Israel's right to exist,